Hey everyone, welcome to Dave's Bonsai. On today's episode, it's time for some air layering. I'd like to start off today's show by a big thank you to all the folks who have served in our military over the course of our history. Today is Memorial Day, and the family's coming over later on today for a little bit of a small picnic, but I have time this morning where I get to work on another show, so that's what I'm going to get going. But I want to say a big thank you to all those who have served, who will serve, those who have been lost, a debt of gratitude to all those folks that have laid down their life for us so we can have what we have in this amazing country. So a big thank you. This is going to be a fun show for me because I get to air layer. I haven't air layered for a couple of years. There's a Japanese maple that I did 2 or 3 years ago that I'll put a link in the description, and I'll show you what episode that is from a long time ago. It's quite a while ago, and those trees are still alive, so we'll pull those out in a little bit. So first, it's an absolutely stunning morning. Went for a walk this morning. It was a gray overcast day after 3 or 4 days of grayness, and a week where we had some low temperatures at night that went back down into the upper 30s. Well, close. I think here in my neighborhood we were right around that 40 range. So there were frost warnings as far south as St. Cloud, Minnesota, and even the metro was under a warning. Or a watch for that frost. So all the tropical plants had to do the dance again. I brought them into the garage for 2 nights. I even put a heater in the garage just to make sure, and so those trees wouldn't be affected too much. Now, if it hit 40 a couple of nights, would those trees have really suffered? Hard to tell. I've got some younger trees, some trees that aren't as established yet, so I erred on the side of caution, put them in the garage. A lot of the trees are now back on the bench, and they're getting the sunshine right now in the early morning because the sun just peeked out, and then that sun will go behind the garage a little bit later. So those trees have been slowly acclimated to sun, and starting this next week I'll be able to pop them into the sunshine. We will hit 80s again this week, so highs into the 60s and 70s something today, and now we're going to be back into the 80s for most of this week. You never know in Minnesota, so we always have to be careful and taking a peek at our trees. The other exciting news that has happened in the last week is I got a big shipment from Weigert's, and part of the Minnesota Bonsai Society workshops is to have a tropical workshop in July, and the trees have arrived in Minnesota. And of course they arrived the first day that night temp was going to be 38, 40 degrees. So I unloaded all the trees. I opened them up from the packing peanuts and the saran wrap, keeping them all together. I put them out to expose them to some fresh air after a 4-day shipping trip. Yeah, kind of scary. And they were in my garage for a couple of nights. So right now you're looking at a couple of shots from the displacement of the trees in my yard after the temps warmed back up. So I have trees all over the yard. They've tucked in pretty nicely, some on the deck, some on the cabin cold frame dock, and they're kind of filling up the garden. So the garden is lush and full of plants, and we're looking like a little mini nursery here at Dave's house. So those trees will be used for the workshops in July. So we've got Premnas as one of the varieties, and Melinas. So they're going to be some fun tropical trees. Some of them have double and triple trunks, so people are going to get bang for their buck, I hope, and have a good time in those workshops. In the meantime, it's May 31st. It's Memorial Day. Happy Memorial Day to everybody, and we're going to do some air layering. So it's the big Japanese maple that I've had in a box for, this is its 2nd year in a box now. Got a nice nursery find at my favorite nursery place, just sitting there all by itself. Real big thick trunk, but it doesn't have the greatest branch placement, and so I knew early on that I would probably be chopping this thing down at some point and or air layering. And so a couple of reasons we can air layer, and one of the reasons that I didn't think about when I did my first air layer was to get a better nabari. So if you have a pretty decent tree, but the foliage is really high, and you've got this big old straight trunk with not much movement, and it's just not so great. If you can air layer it somewhere halfway down the trunk where it starts to taper in, you can air layer that tree and maybe get a new nabari that has a lot of radial roots, and you can kind of start over, and then you can just throw the root system in the nabari section away. Most of the time, or the only two times I've air layered, I've kept both parts, the top and the bottom. So we're going to try to do that with this tree. I want to keep the big base, that's a pretty nice diameter, and try to get some more air layering up on top. So the goal today is to get at least one solid air layer, but I might be pushing to try to do two, but I don't have a lot of great spots on this tree. So the problem with this particular tree, and I'll show you some images and we'll try to get some good close-ups for you to see. One of the big problems of this tree is most maple trees, of course, grow in threes. And we may go back in the early spring, depending upon where we are with our tree, development, ramification, the refinement stage. But if it's going to have three, these two grow out, and we often will pinch that middle one away. Now, on my tree, I've let it just go out the last 2 years. I did a little trimming last year at the end of the year to kind of keep it back in, and now it's growing again this year, and I've got some shoots that are a couple of feet long, and it's just growing like gangbusters, which is what my desire was. For two reasons. One, I wanted to get all healthy and have a lot of foliage for air layering, because I wanted all that photosynthesis to be going on, so when we get the air layer all nice and snug and ready to go, we're going to have a lot of movement of the starches and sugars and the water and everything that's moving from photosynthesis to help to supply some new root growth where the air layer is. The other reason that I'm growing out these branches long is I'm going to probably do a thread graft in the next year or two. I'd like to do it next year, but next year might be the year I repot. And I don't know, I'm going to have to talk to my MBS friends about if I do this repot, can I do one thread graft at the same time? Two big operations, but the thread graft, going to be one hole through the trunk and a branch sticking up through there. I've got to do more of my research. So I'm growing those out too for that reason. So multiple reasons to grow out, plus it's a young tree in development, we just let it grow up like crazy. But the trunk is pretty thick and I want to bring this thing down more compact. Right now it's a 4-foot tree, too big. I got to bring it all down. We're looking for a pot for this tree, but it's time to air layer. But getting back to the three, so if I cut this out, these two are going to grow, and you've got the bifurcation, in this case trifurcation in a way, right? And then it goes up and splits again. Well, the tree looks like that now from one side. If you turn it to one side, it's got three main branches that are almost like this, so smooth together. There's no movement like this and a real nice flaring of the branches. They're flat like this. So do I chop a big one like this and hope these have a little bit of good design to it? Do I try to get in there and chop the middle one out but then have this really kind of more shape like this? I don't know if I can like that. So what I'm going to do today is where the three main branches go up from the main trunk, that primary set of branches that did divide into three, they're really strong, thick branches in their own right. I'm going to air layer this guy right here. So then I'll have these two left, and then I'll chop everything down low here and see what can grow there. And or, after the air layer is successful next year, I may chop it. I may chop it completely off the next year or the year after. Lots of things to consider. But I want to go from 3 to 2, but I'm going to save this branch because it's got a little bit of movement. And so we're going to do an air layer there, and we're going to try to make that trunk as nice as possible, try to get some good ramification, or I should say root flare, 360 degree, disbursement of roots. So that radial root pattern is important, and we're going to try to get that with this air layer. So the first thing we have to do is we got to go move the beast. It's sitting over there by the cabin, and we got to bring it over here to my work area today. We're going to have sunshine now, so we're going to have to deal with some bright lights and shadows and all that kind of stuff. But hey, let's dig in. Let's look at this air layer, and let's make this work. Well, with a little bit of muscle, we got the tree in place. So I have to say, I've been working out at the gym this year, new gym membership in January, and I was working on some of my squats the last couple of months. And so practicing lifting with the legs. This is one of those things where we have to lift with our legs so we don't hurt our backs. My heaviest tree by far. This thing's big. So a couple of things about this tree. So this is a Japanese maple. I believe it was grafted onto more of a Minnesota hardy variety. Don't know what. There's some discoloration down here and some bulging, and so it looks like there's a couple different trunked images here if you look closer. It has this, it had this one branch when I picked it up at the nursery a couple of years ago, and I said, oh, we've got a branch down there. We got a little bit of movement here. I could chop this tree right here at some point. The tree is a little bit thick. I've not done a chunk chop with the tree this thick. We've got 2 inches left to right, but most maple trees grow ferociously. I might be chopping this thing down to size somewhere here, and then I've got this as a primary branch. It's since grown a second one out. It's growing from the same location, so this could be a big bulge someday. You can see there's already a little bit of a bulgeness right here. This could be a thread graft branch in a couple of years. We'll let this keep growing out, and then we'll bend this around and graft it through the tree over here somewhere. So we'll let both of these grow, sacrificial if you will, but they're just going to grow like crazy. And this one, all this is new growth, this last half of the branch or so. About 20 inches from the soil line, we get our split of 3. So again, very common for a maple tree. We have splits right here as it keeps growing, right? We have leaf, leaf, the growth, leaf, leaf, the growth, leaf, leaf, and it keeps growing out. So as I cut this one off, then we have the 2. If I were to cut this right here, we'd have 2. And then hopefully that would grow out and divide, 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 bifurcate. But the main life of the tree is right there. And so we got this gnarly trunk movement. We got a little bit of movement this way. But the tree never had like this great front, if you will, from 2 of the sides for sure. There's the side that I was explaining where you can see right through the tree. So it's this side or the other side, and this side curves up towards us. But it's 20 inches up here, makes for, 3 feet of tree above what I've got as an 8-inch pot down here. It's just too tall, and I want to bring it back. So it's a fun looking tree right now. It's big, it's beautiful. It's been a conversation piece for anybody who's come over to the house. Do I cut this middle one off and have this split here? Will this become just this big bulge if I let this all go? Can I salvage some of that if I chop it here? Could I make the air layer right here? But if I make the air layer right here, there's still this triple division here. It's not as aesthetically pleasing, perhaps. Not awful. This one up top splits into 3 more. Again, more in a kind of a round circular area, not so flat. So do I have enough room to air layer this right here? That's a possibility. And then this branch right here does another triple. But the branch has a little bit more movement up here. This one up here, and it's got another big growth right here. So this guy right here is growing off of this one. So these 2 could be a good branch, and this one was chopped right here. It's growing a nice new leader here, but we could get this completely off and have a double, a bi, kind of a Y shape. And this has a little bit of movement from where it stems off the trunk and comes up here. This right here might be a decent area for a air layer. And that's how I envisioned this one. And from the other side, you can see here's this right here, and here's growth right here, and here's the growth I was showing you from the other angle. So if I do an air layer right here, right in here, this becomes a 1, 2, 3, but in different alternating areas become a much better place for air layering. So I'm going to air layer the first one today right there. In the first air layer of the other Japanese maple, I just cut it straight. Perpendicular, if you will, with the way that the trunk is growing. So if this was sitting straight up and down from the ground, I would be just cutting a nice straight angle like this and this. But I'm not going to do that with this air layer. If I want this to have a really wide nabari, the widest nabari would be if I have a really long angle like this. So if I have an angle like this and like this, now the distance between here and here, this point and up here, this is maybe 1 3/4 inches instead of 1.5 inches. So now I have a base of the trunk that's 1 3/4 inches instead of just straight perpendicular, which gives me 1.5 inches. So if I can find the right angle, I can try to make that happen. Now, this swoops up this way, right here. It kind of swoops up this way. So I would imagine planting this tree at the angle it's planted right now, and then it goes up and reaches up towards the sun. So I would want the angle to be this way. So I'm going to cut it this way, not this way, right? Or not this way. And to put a pot in here and get the right angle would be really hard this way. So we have to cut it this way. So we have a nice bump here to back over here. This could provide a nice base for this tree, and this can go down right there to as low as I can go. There's that 2-inch range. Even if the top is right here, then I've got this movement right out of the ground, and then it splits into 2 big branches, and this splits off into 3. So this back one could even come off completely. This one could come off completely, and I could just have this be my main tree here to a branch right here, and I got boom, boom, and there's one back here and a couple up here. We'd be good to go. So we have to find that line. So we can draw it with a Sharpie if we want to, or we can just start digging in. And the important part is we want to cut the top as clean as possible, and then the bottom is not quite as important, but it's certainly something we're going to try to strive to make clean. But this cut right here is going to be nice and even and clean, so it's time to get out some tools and do some cutting. Before I dig into the big maple for the air layer, I wanted to show you the kind of the follow-up of the first air layer I ever did. And the first air layer I ever did was on this Japanese maple, where I had the tree that was super long. Something like this. Let's do it this way. This was the tree. So of course I've got video. I'll link the episode and you can go take a peek. Turned into 2 trees. These do grow pretty profusely, so this is has survived and done well, and I just letting it grow out this year. This is, I think, year 3 in the garden after the air layer, maybe year 4. I gotta go check the dates. And this was the top of the tree. Now, where I did the air layer, you'll notice there's a curve right here. If I'd have been a little bit smarter with my air layer back when I did it, perhaps I would have creeped up a little bit higher to have this curve come right out of the ground, and I could have put it at an angle like this right out of this part right here. So I would have maybe moved up a couple of inches. Maybe I would have angled the cut. Instead of cutting it straight like this, because I really didn't know better, I just cut some of the bark off, put the root hormone powder in there, and went to town. Got a lot of great roots, had a lot of success, and the tree is still doing well. But there is an example of a before tree that is now 2 after trees with air layering. And I wasn't quite thorough in thinking about where the actual air layer would be. On this big maple, I've got some ideas. As I prepare to start digging into this tree, I want to make sure that my tools are sanitized. So one of the most important steps in air layering that everybody will repeat is clean tools. You should clean your tools between all your projects anyway, so we don't transfer any microorganisms, any disease, fungal. So I've got some rubbing alcohol. You can use your basic disinfectant solution, whatever brand you like, and you're going to clean your tools really, really well. Instead of air layering straight up and down to have a straight up and down bark, we're going to angle it like this. And I'm going to go right about here and down to here. This is about 1.5 inches, a little less. So if we 1.5 that, it's going to be about 2 1/4. So you want to have about a 2 1/4 spot that we can peel away this bark at an angle something like this. So that's going to come right down to here. It's come right up to here. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to make my first line that I want to work on this. And it's going to come right here. And the tree's going to move around. So I'm getting that first initial cutting around. This part of the tree. And again, we're going to want this top part to be as clean as possible. So now we're going to go ahead, we're going to split the wood right down here. And we're going to peel this bark off. And this is the fun part. The first time you peel this back, and you see tree, you know that you've gotten rid of that first bark layer, and this all should come up pretty easily. And when you see the little green in here, you know that outer cambium layer that's helping to transport all the good stuff. We need to go around the entire tree, of course, being very careful with these sharp tools, not to poke yourself, not having you pointing any of these blades towards you, but away from you, of course. Basic knife and cutlery safety, right? So when you're finding a spot to air layer, you want to make sure that there's good flow, good sap flow, that there's no real big like dead portions to your tree. So it's a really pretty clean spot. This one does have a little old stub right up there above my line, which might actually induce more growth because that's where a shoot was out before and had been cut off or died back. So there is the startings of our air layering. Now, as I had mentioned before, we want to make sure that this is super nice and clean up here. So any of these pieces that are kind of dangling down and not real clean, I'm going to go around and make sure that they are a super clean cut. So one of the problems, if you don't cut a big enough section off, if you don't make this big enough, sometimes the tree will work really hard and try to heal itself and could create a bridge of connection with this cambium layer, trying to dig into the soft tissue here or the hardwood section and trying to get rid of all this extra cambium. So you see I'm scraping away this soft section here. That tool I was using before, super sharp. It's a new blade. I can go and get all of that extra soft tissue stuff off of there. Now, some people also will take a concave cutter and actually cut more of this wood away. So you are assured you're getting deep in there. So in other words, don't be afraid to really clean this out. You're not going to decrease your chances for success. You're probably only going to increase them. As you can see with the sun coming out, I've already shed a layer because it's going to get warm. So my last air layer, the maple I showed earlier, was a saran wrap style wrap around a plastic bag. So you cup the plastic bag around where your air layer is going to be. You put sphagnum moss in there, and then you're going to secure that with either some saran wrap, or as you can see in other videos, people will just put around some wire, wrap the wire around the bag to hold it snug. One of the more important things about air layering is making sure that that air layer pocket of stuff is really solid and not going to shimmy around a lot. Because when those roots just start coming out for the first several weeks, months of its journey, those roots are very fragile, very, very sensitive, and easy to break. And so if you have shifts, even in a strong storm, I may have to consider moving this in the garage so this thing doesn't go all over the place. Now, it's on a sturdy part of the tree, it shouldn't move. But if it was on a branch that's going to move all over the place, you want that to be nice and still to not ruin the roots. Air layering can work on both methods, whether you use the bag or the pot. I'm going to use the pot for the first time, and I'm going to use it for this reason. I could not find any sphagnum moss. I'm completely out of sphagnum moss, and I went to a couple of stores just this past weekend here, and everybody's out. Hard to come by. But you can also root trees, especially like the maple here. You can get a lot of root growth, and the air layering can be successful with just your bonsai soil. So I'm using one of my smaller grit of bonsai soil. So I have some pumice in there, some akadama in there for some moisture retention. I have the lava rock in there, and I also have some sphagnum peat moss to add a little bit of moisture, to keep the moisture level a little higher. So the akadama and the sphagnum peat moss, which is more fine, almost dirt-like than the sphagnum, just the sphagnum moss that I get for grading and sifting for the tops of my trees and for air layering, thick and stringy. This is more of a fine substance, so I don't want too much of that, but I want that to provide some moisture with the akadama. So that's all going to sit in a pot for me. Because I don't have the sphagnum moss, it'll be a little bit harder with soil to put into a bag like that. One of the advantages of using a pot that I've heard in my research, and why I'm moving to this for this particular one, partly because of the sphagnum moss, partly because I want to try the pot method, and also when you're done and ready to cut this branch off and have it start as a bonsai, if you use sphagnum moss, that first cutting that you make of the tree and you put it into a bigger pot or something from the wrap or whatever, you don't take a lot of sphagnum moss off, just the top layer maybe, so you can kind of maybe see where the roots start. You put that in a pot and let it go for another year. But at some point, you're going to have to dig some of that sphagnum moss off, if not all of it. And the roots are so sensitive again in that first year that if you're digging through all that sphagnum moss, you're going to break off probably a ton of roots and damage the tree, and it might not survive. So with the bonsai soil, you don't have to dig any sphagnum moss out. And then after a year or two in this pot, when you go to repot this one for the first time into a nicer pot, you're just going to be getting rid of bonsai soil and putting new bonsai soil in. So kind of an advantage, I think, and worth a try. Now the trick, of course, is fitting a pot within the upper canopy of a tree. If this is just around the base of this current tree, no problem, sit it in there and let it go crazy. This is going to be higher up, so I have to find a way to kind of secure it in its place, which again will have to be some kind of wrap that I'll put on there, some tape that I might have to wrap around there a little bit, and so I have to prepare the pot. So I have a couple different size pots. I think this one's going to be a little bit too big for the congestion up in my tree, so this is a little bit too wide. But you notice there's a hole cut out in here, and we had to cut the pot to make that hole. So this wraps around the tree, and then you can staple it shut, you can tape it shut, you put your soil in there, and you're good to go. Now the challenge with this is, let's look at all those drainage holes. Fantastic. We still need the drainage holes. We don't want water sitting in there, just like in our bonsai pots. But the soil that I'm using is smaller than this size hole, so I'm going to have to plug this out. Now that pot, it would be hard to put a screen mesh over that because I still need the hole here. And so one of the things that I have used on some of my pots, and there's controversy out there about using the sheetrock tape, but I need to cover these holes a little bit so my soil doesn't fall through and create a lot of air pockets, which would kill the roots. So I have to cover this up with something, and I don't have any screen in the house, but I have this sheetrock tape that I use quite often, and I'll put some sheetrock in here to cover these holes a little bit so the water still goes through. It won't shift around because this will stick to it a little bit, and it'll hold the soil in there, but still allow a lot of drainage. And so for the air layer, where it's going to sit there for probably 6 months, or I might even keep it on until next spring, it's going to be sitting in place fine, but I have to cover up some of those holes. But we have to see what's going to fit. So as I come under the tree, this pot actually might work out better than I thought. So as you see, if I bring this around here, my hole is pretty close to the size of the tree, but here's the part I'm concerned about. The pot is going to sit a little crooked. And so from my research too, in doing the air layering, I don't want to have a wall of this pot like super close on this side, like coming right there, so there's not much gap there, but then there's a big gap over here. Here I'm going to run in the problem of having a small gap over here. The pot's going to fit like this instead of center. We want the pot to be as much in center as possible so those roots have an equal chance of growing radially, a radial pattern around this new trunk line, right? And so we want to make sure that we have it as centered in the pot as possible. So again, if I put this on here, if it hangs like this, it's decent. If I put it up like this, let me get the whole side down here. But if I angle it like this, but it's not covering the whole air layer here, it's a little bit snug here. But I like the size of that pot. So let's go ahead and try this guy. And that sits there a lot nicer. And it's a flexible pot, so I can kind of force it on this back tree a little bit. And if you can see, I can try to staple this together and angle it up. And if I circle around here, I am covering, I think, all of that bottom section. Now the important part of the air layer, the roots are going to form from here, so this bottom part isn't as crucial, but we do want it covered. And just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put that wire clamp in here to cut off any chance of circulation going through there. And so we're going to go ahead and do that next. I'm just going to put the wire right here at the base. I'm going to go ahead and grab my pliers. Putting a lot of pressure on here. And so by pressuring this real tight, this is going to keep also less nutrients from going up here on this outside layer. We want all the roots to form right here. So some people will tie this right around a live vein branch, and then it might get an air layer that would work right there and roots form. I'm doing it down here to be safe. I got this right here. I'm going to cut off as much extra as I can now. There we go. The sheetrock tape is in place. I was able to cut real thin sections, and it sticks to the pot just enough to be nice and flexible and mold itself to those holes. And you can see through there, the drainage is still there. I can move my pot and put that in place and get ready for some soil. So we're going to get that in place. I'm going to go grab my soil and we'll get this thing going. We're going to put a little root hormone powder on this air layer. Again, with some maple varieties, they shoot out new roots, and they shoot out with air layers pretty fast and quickly, and pretty successful. I learned this technique from Peter Warren, so I'll have a link in the description if you want to check out Peter Warren's YouTube channel. Peter has a great YouTube version of air layering that you can peek at as well, and gets into a little bit more in-depth and some of the a little bit of the scientific reasoning behind some of the things, and it just does a great job of showing some air layering techniques. And this one is one I learned from him. So what he essentially did is he took a paper towel from your kitchen, And he went ahead and he took a piece out that you're going to wrap around the tree. I've heard of people just dusting the hormone powder on after you spray the tree a little bit. I'm going to make sure that this fits around the branch. And it does. So you have a little paper towel strip and you get it wet. And then you can put your root hormone. Now some people again will mix this into a little paste. I've heard of that and I haven't tried that yet. But we're just going to put some root hormone on this paper towel. And this will stick to the paper towel, a fair amount of it. Less will be lost than just throwing the powder up there alone. The birds are chirping like crazy today. We've got some blue jays today. Your typical crows are cawing a little bit. The cardinals have been out. So here we go. There we have a paper towel that is loaded with our hormones. Let's put that on the tree. So the nice thing about the paper towel is it sticks to the tree, sticks to itself. We have root hormone securely on this tree. At the top part. Now, before we put our soil into the pot and get this ready to go, we're going to get the soil a little bit wet. So the soil already goes on wet, so we don't have to water it for a couple of days. And once the soil goes on wet, it won't. What happened to me the first time when I put my air layer on, I know that I watered too soon, and I think I washed away all the root hormone powder. So this will hold the powder in place better. Plus, if I have wet soil to begin with and we wrap it up tight, it's going to sit there for a couple of days. I won't have to water right away, and that root hormone will kind of stick to that trunk there and do its stuff and get started. So I'm going to moisten the soil a little bit here and we'll get ready for application. Got a little bit of that sphagnum moss, peat moss that's in there to hold the moisture, and there's even some perlite in there. So we want to still have some oxygen in there. We want to have the moisture retention in there. And we're getting the soil moist so we don't have to douse it with water later. And again, you can just use 100% sphagnum moss. You just have to be super careful when you remove the bags and the pots and repot that you don't damage the roots. So this seems pretty good. We're ready to put some of that in a pot and finish our air layer. Here we go. We'll try to get this around here without disturbing the blue. And then what we have to do is we have to at least staple this into place at some point. So I'm going to go ahead and cradle it just a little bit. And it's a long stapler, so I can go all the way to the bottom. Boom, boom, boom. I have a pot that's sturdy. It's in there. And what I am going to do is when the soil is in there, so notice how it's leaning down. Again, I want this to be up like this as much as possible to have the tree in the center as much as possible. Okay. That also is going to allow me to fill this up with soil above our line here, because we have to get above our line here. I do have a little bit of this paper towel. I have the paper towel a little bit higher than the actual rind, so I do have a little bit of leeway there, but we want to make sure it's all covered in our soil. Make sure everything's situated in there. I'm going to put the crack up there. All right, everything's in place for me to throw some soil in there. I have seen a lot of squirrels bother this tree this year. So I want to make sure that this is going to be in good standing with the squirrels. If they happen to climb this tree, that's not going to go all over the place. So there's our air layer snug in place. Looks like we have some air pockets down below. So just as in a repot, I want to get rid of some of those air pockets. Tamp down some of that soil in there. Yeah, that's tighter. That feels much better. Okay, we have soil to the brim. Now, back to my squirrel conversation. I don't want the squirrels to be climbing up this and digging on that. So I'm actually going to not wire this to the tree, but I'm going to go ahead and wrap around some saran wrap to the tree to hope that I get some stability. Now I can go around the whole tree. I'd like to go around this secondary branch here, but that'll be hard to do with my great big saran wrap. So I'm going to go ahead and cut some small sections. So here's my saran wrap device. I'm going to get a nice long section. I'm going to go ahead and break it free. I'm going to see if I can start to wrap this now around maybe this upper branch right here. Now I'm not aiming to get this to be pretty as much as securing this to the tree. It's got to stick to something. So I'm going around portions of the tree, pulling snug. I'm going to tuck it in underneath here, and we'll get a second piece. So there's one. So again, I'm taking my roll. I'm going to get myself some tape, cellophane here, and wrap around. So I've wrapped some cellophane to keep this is not moving. If I move this, the whole tree is moving. The soil is nice and firm in there, and we are in good shape. Now what I will do is I'm going to put one more layer of cellophane right over this side, because this pot is at such an angle. We'll let a little bit more water penetrate down here, and of course it's going to come out all these holes down here, so we're good. And this will drain real nice. So let me put on another one, and we'll check and see if everything is where we need it to be. I just created a little bit extra lip for the pot here with cellophane, and I'm actually going to go hit and get some of my sphagnum peat moss. And even though I don't have the sphagnum, the 100% sphagnum, the long grain sphagnum, I'm going to put a little bit of sphagnum peat moss on top, which again will hold a little bit more moisture on that top so it doesn't dry out as fast on top. And then of course it'll all still drain really well. So let's get some of that in there, and we'll take a closer look. So I went ahead and got some sphagnum peat moss. And one of the hardest things about this sphagnum peat moss is It's so powdery at first, but we're able to mix it with some water. And then I have a top dressing. The sun is coming in and out of the clouds, so we're getting some bright spots and dark spots. But there we have our air layer. Everything is really snug to the tree. The whole tree moves when I move the pot. The soil is in there. We got the rooting hormone powder on that piece of toilet or paper towel that's sticking to the trunk. We cleaned it all out real good. We put that wire as kind of a tourniquet down lower, and we have an air layer. And if I give it the 360, the sun is shining through, the leaves are, and there we have a completed air layer. Now, this will probably start getting roots within several weeks. I am not going to look at this to take out this air layer until probably next spring. I just want it to grow this whole year and have a lot of success. There might be a chance that I might see some roots growing out underneath the bottom of the pot, and if I see that, that would be really super exciting. But we're going to let this grow. This is May 31st. We've got June, July, August, September, October to grow some roots. We have a really good chunk of time. This will be put back in the cold frame once we're done growing for the year. We will make sure it's defoliated as we go into the storage frame this year. It's so big and so lush full of leaves. We will do that. Back in its home. So the reason why I moved kind of slowly across the grass is because, again, I didn't want to have this great, four-wheel and trip over all the terrain and shimmy all the soil and make some possible air pockets. So I wanted to slowly roll it over here and get it back in its home. So it is really liked life over here so far in the month of April and May. We're going to leave it here. Again, my ash tree will provide midday hot sun relief, but there's a big gap of no trees, so we got sun in the afternoon, late afternoon, sun in the earlier part of the day leading up to the mid-afternoon, and so it gets plenty of sun and plenty of shade for protection and cooling off of the leaves in the hot summer days. So we're going to leave it right here. The air layer is in there in place. Let's hope the critters leave it alone, and as we always do with the bonsai, we will keep checking this thing over and over again. So I'm going to take a peek at an Amur maple and possibly do an air layer with that today too. I might record that, I might not. Maybe I'll do a time lapse of that. But this is going to wrap it up for another edition of Dave's Bonsai. And thank you so much for watching. Click like, subscribe if you haven't already. Send me some comments, good, bad, indifferent. Love hearing from everybody. I have learned so much by doing these videos and hearing comments from people and suggestions and things I never thought about. So I'm learning as much as I hope you're learning, and then some. So thanks for watching. Happy Memorial Day to you a few days late whenever you're watching this. And can't wait to show some updates on this in a future video. So take care of yourself, take care of your bonsai, and we'll catch you on the next episode.